So this episode will relay excerpts of a fantastic presentation by Jamie Mahony on Ireland-Israel relations. Jamie's a 21-year-old student originally from Limerick. He is studying international business at DCU and is currently spending his third year on Erasmus in Strasbourg Business School. Since May of this year, he is also a student fellow with CAMERA, that is the Committee for Accuracy and Middle East Reporting and Analysis. Earlier this year, a clip of Jamie went viral on Instagram and other social media platforms after he courageously held a one faux historian Ilan Pape to account. Jamie was physically assaulted at this event, but his bravery in speaking truth to power did not go unnoticed. He later spoke of his experience on GB News and featured in several Jewish-Israeli mainstream media news articles. The official title of his presentation was Ireland and Israel, A History of Relations and Contemporary Analysis. In this opening section, Jamie gives an overview of the historical, cultural and geopolitical overlap and ties between Ireland and Israel.
I'm from Limerick. I'm a student in DCU, currently on Erasmus abroad. Opening question, some of you will know the answer, but I allow those of you who don't have a guess first. So, who is the only international foreign leader in the world who is entitled to an Irish passport? President Isaac Herzog of Israel. And it's an amazing connection that we have with the country. The only head of state worldwide who is entitled to an Irish passport. And yet it's glanced over and forgotten about, despite normally, the Irish connection to the diaspora being played upon very heavily. Unfortunately, in this case, people like to forget about it. And if you can see the next slide here, you see the Herzog family ascended. So Yitzhak Herzog was the chief rabbi of Ireland for almost 20 years. Back in the 1920s and 30s, he was actually known as the Sinn Féin rabbi because of his strong Republican views. He spoke Irish and also Hebrew and saw Zionism and Irish Republicanism at that time as common causes, both seen as movements of national liberation, essentially new ethnic nation states for different peoples. He made Aliyah to what was then mandatory Palestine in, I believe, 1935. He became the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the Yeshuv. And from 1948 onwards, he was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel for well over a decade. And his son, Chaim Herzog, was president of Israel for 10 years between 83 and 93. And Chaim's son, Isaac, is now president of Israel. So it's an incredible familial connection that people unfortunately like to gloss over. But this is my go-to argument if anyone says that, the so-called Palestinians, as they're called, they want to say that Ireland has more of a connection to the Palestinian cause. There is no stronger evidence against that than this. Around the same time, so we're talking early 20th century, Ed Blackhorn, a nationalist writer, was writing pamphlets about how Zionism and Irish Republicanism were, again, common causes. And this is just a remarkable quote from a pamphlet in 1912 saying, Israel represents the triumph of Sinn Féin. Language revival, so this is in the kind of late 19th century again. The revival of the language of Hebrew is one of the most extraordinary things about Zionism from the era of Theodor Herzl. Eliezer Ben Yehuda, born in modern day Belarus, I think he spoke at the end of his life maybe 7 or 8 languages, but he was key in reviving Hebrew and advocating for it to be a spoken language amongst Jews who were making Aliyah to the region of Israel. He actually was involved in one of the earliest waves of immigration in 1881. And then of course our own Owen McNeill, founder of the Gaelic League in Ireland in 1893, I believe. And yeah, again, just two figures of really pushing the same message of the cultural and language revival. And then yeah, 2 other figures just that I wanted to touch on. This is a photo I took in a former prison in Akko in northern Israel. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, one of the heroes of early pre-1948 Zionism. Again, a guy who during his time in prison under the British was translating fantastic pieces of literature such as Dante's Inferno into Hebrew for the Jewish community of the area to basically expand the usage of the language. And then on a similar note, Michael Cusack, founding the GAA in Thurles in 1884, I would see that as a very kind of momentous occasion in terms of trying to revive Gaelic nationalism at the time. Some more connections. Yitzhak Shamir. So Yitzhak Shamir was Prime Minister of Israel in the 1980s, but during his time with Lehi, a Jewish militia, while the British still controlled the land, he took on the nom de guerre of Michael Collins. So it's just extraordinary, like he saw Michael Collins as an inspiring figure who really took the fight to the British as he was trying to do at the time. So that's another incredible link. And then Menachem Begin, one of my favourite figures of Israeli history. These were writings from, I believe, the 1920s. Basically, you can read it for yourselves, but he's touching on the fact that he saw Zionism and Jews of that time building their communities under British mandatory Palestine as ensuring the continuance and flourishing of a race of people. And it's very interesting to me that he was taking note at the time of Irish nationalism and wanting to model Zionism on it at the time. And then some notable Irish Jewish politicians over the last century. So we'd Robert Briscoe, again, he was around the same time of the Sinn Féin rabbi, as we call him, Yitzhak Herzog. His son, Ben Briscoe, of course, went on to be a Fianna Fáil TD. Gerald Goldberg, Lord Mayor of Cork in the 1970s. And my good friend and mentor, Alan Shatter, who was a TD for about 40 years, including being Minister for Justice.
In the following segments, Jamie touches on some examples of historical anti-Semitism and contemporary anti-Israeli sentiment in Ireland, including some choice tweets by Colin Burke TD and some unfounded anti-Israeli statements by outgoing President Michael D. Higgins.
1904, it's very blurry, but this is a new book that came out over the summer about it. It's the Limerick boycott. In context, Father John Cray on the right there, very anti-Semitic priest, and he gave a series of sermons essentially that led to the members of a church on a Sunday morning after Mass going down to the Jewish district of Limerick, beating people up, burning businesses, etc., and then a continued economic boycott that lasted 2 years that led to much of the community leaving that part of the city, unfortunately. One actually interesting thing to note is, I'm sure some of you will know of Simon Sebag Montefiore, the historian. One of his ancestors was actually living in Limerick at the time and was driven out, unfortunately, by the pogrom and boycott. Arthur Griffith, founder of Sinn Féin in 1905, while in some ways he admired Zionism as a cause, he was very anti-Semitic towards Jews. You have a couple of quotes there, including from Rhea Cronin, who's a Sinn Féin TD in Meath today. When she was elected, people saw some of her tweets claiming that Jews were responsible for European wars, Hitler being a pawn of the Rothschilds, Mossad, all the worst modern day conspiracy theories about Jews. And yet, of course, no disciplinary action from Sinn Féin, because Sinn Féin are willing to turn a blind eye to that sort of behaviour. And as I say, she's still a TD in the Dáil today. We got Chris Andrews, who was on the ridiculous flotilla only last week. He has also made some pretty outrageous statements. But as I say, and then you could the list goes on amongst Sinn Féin TDs. They can say the most horrific stuff, and no one really cares. And then, of course, Mick Wallace. We'll come to him in a few minutes as well. I do think he's quite mentally unwell, to be honest, in terms of the path he's been on over the last years.
So here Jamie put up a pic of Ruth Coppinger and Mick Wallace, hence the laughter at the start of the clip.
Yeah, here we are. This pair of clowns, this was them in Yemen at the start of this year. I think it was in January. They went there for a Houthi conference, and this was in Iran. Actually, prior to the 12-day war. You'll be pleased to know that this general, I believe Ali Shadmani, is now dead and was taken out by the Israelis during the 12-day war. But this pair really have gone on a true descent over the last few years in terms of promoting Russia, China and Iran, the anti-Western axis, we'd say. But the fact that since they've lost their seats in the European Parliament in June 2024, they've actually started visiting these places and been totally unabashed in terms of their love for them. So yeah, we can pity them, really, you know.
Following on from that, Jamie touched on the topic of Eamon de Valera's signing of the Book of Condolences in the German embassy on the occasion of Adolf Hitler's death. Not exactly our proudest moment on the international stage, plus some contemporary examples of Irish antipathy toward Jews.
There's a particular black spot, I would say, in terms of Irish-Jewish relations historically. This is Mr. Edward Hempel. He was the German ambassador in Dublin during the Second World War. And this is Eamon de Valera, who on May 2nd, 1945, went to express condolences on the death of the Führer Adolf Hitler. I'm often puzzled by it. I think a lot of historians are, as to the motives. But yeah, as I say, it's a very dark moment when you look back on a man that shaped the state for the first 50 years of our existence. But these are some messages put out by Fine Gael politicians. So with Colin Burke here essentially associating a quote from Sigmund Freud, psychologist who lived in Vienna at the time. It's a quote from him about human nature and the tendency towards aggression and violence. But he, of course, felt the need to say that Sigmund Freud was Jewish, and we all knew what he was insinuating, and he knew he was wrong because he deleted the tweet after only an hour. And this is, again, a Fine Gael councillor. The pleasure taken in aggression and destruction is one of the motivations for war. Jewish psychiatrist Sigmund Freud.
Oh, right.
And he deleted it only an hour later. So the question of embassies. Now, this was a very illustrative thing that happened last year. After countless diplomatic assaults, Gideon Sar, the Israeli foreign minister, decided to withdraw the embassy in Dublin last December. However, only 4 months earlier, September 2024, we had opened up an embassy in Tehran, no less. And I just thought that was such a highlights. This is a quote from Michael E. Higgins saying that Benjamin Netanyahu wanted a settlement in Egypt. Apparently he has an insight into what goes on in the rooms in Jerusalem. So this is from the Holocaust commemoration ceremony in Dublin in January. Lior Tibet, who I had the pleasure of meeting a few weeks ago, in response to our anti-Semitic president trying to compare the war in Gaza to the Holocaust, something that had no place at that ceremony, she and a few others stood up and silently turned their back to the president, and for that they were physically removed from the event. And that made a lot of international headlines, I think, and with good reason. It was one of the darkest moments in the last 2 years, I would say, on our relations.
In the following segment, Jamie gives a summary of Ireland-Israel relations since 1948.
So we've got a timeline here of relations with the State of Israel since 1948. It actually took Ireland 15 years to recognise Israel. Until 1963, we were behind countries like the Soviet Union and Iran at the time to recognise Israel. But in 1975, diplomatic relations were opened, and in 1996, we had official embassies. We'll come to them in a few minutes as well. But relations were never that good, I have to say, for a couple of reasons. The UNIFIL missions, so from 1978, you had Irish troops in southern Lebanon with UNIFIL, and as we've seen right up to last year with the war with Hezbollah, those UNIFIL troops were nothing but a hindrance to the operations of the IDF, and who did nothing to prevent military build-ups of Hezbollah for years. And I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen, even on Twitter, videos of Shia villagers, unarmed, not even armed members of Hezbollah, who will literally burn a UN truck if they see it, or will slap around UN troops because they simply don't have either the backing or the balls, frankly, to take them on. But as I say, this is actually 1978, so it was pre-Camp David Accords. Egyptian Air Force pilots receiving their training from Aer Lingus. And you can understand why this would be pretty irritating, to say the least, to officials in Jerusalem, given that Egypt had tried to invade Israel only 5 years before and thankfully failed. I love this photo. It's from a different era, as you can tell, but this is Taoiseach John Bruton with an up-and-coming politician called Benjamin Netanyahu at the time. This was Benjamin Netanyahu over in Ireland in, I believe, he wasn't quite Prime Minister, but it was prior to 96, and he was over, yes, to essentially lobby for an embassy to be opened in Dublin. But it's a fantastic photo that only, I think, came out in the last year.
Contrary to popular opinion, which is largely based on ignorance, the only genuine link between the Irish and the Arabs in Palestine, or Palestinians, is much more recent and rooted in the link between the IRA and the PLO. Have a listen.
Coming into the relationship between the PLO and the IRA, this is what shapes all of present-day anti-Israel sentiment in Ireland. It's a legacy of this relationship, and it's an unfortunate thing because nowadays you have people who, while they would totally abhor the Provos, the relationship has bled down into mainstream society to the point where, of course, you now have people like Fine Gael, who would traditionally be seen as the most anti-IRA political party, joining in on that line. And it's a distortion, as I say, from what we saw only 50, 60 years earlier before the founding of the PLO in 1964. These are two interesting stories of Irish statesmen from the last century. I'm sure you can read this quote by Conor Cruise O'Brien. It's a very interesting quote that I think a lot more Irish people would do well to read in today's terms. He's essentially saying that Irish people, for much of our history, even in the present day, when we are a successful, thriving country, we continually want to see ourselves as victims. We want to side with who we see as the weaker or the oppressed worldwide, and we actually ignore, in many cases, objective morality. So that's an interesting quote from Conor Cruise O'Brien, former minister. Again, I'm not going to read all these out, but these are multiple examples of distinct cooperation between the IRA and the PLO over the years from a military perspective. The most interesting to me actually is the 200 replicas of IRA pipe bombs being found in Jenin. Jenin is in the northern Samaria, or the West Bank. It's long been a terror hotbed, very radical. And these are some quotes from Angus Osnoddig, who's again Sinn Féin TD, conducting a lot of Holocaust inversion and comparing Israel to Nazis.
In the following couple of clips, Jamie discusses two separate instances of anti-Western behaviour on the part of some important Irish Republicans in the 20th century.
But in 1945, May 7th, VE Day, the day Nazism was officially beaten in Europe, a young Charles Haughey was a student at Trinity College Dublin, just up the road. And given that Trinity was traditionally a Protestant, Anglo-Irish institution, you had students there who were waving Union Jacks on May 7th, and understandably so. It just defeated Nazism. But Charlie Haughey and the young Charlie Haughey and a mob of people who thought like him took such exception with this that they actually started beating people up and burned a Union Jack. And this is 1945, so I think it's a very interesting, again, obviously Ireland was neutral during the Second World War, but on the day that Nazism was defeated in Europe, to go and burn a Union Jack is a very interesting kind of essentially anti-Western point in Irish history. Sean Russell, a member of the IRA during World War II on a mission sanctioned by Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister at the time, was on a U-boat from Europe to Ireland with arms to try and attack British forces in the north. He died on board of natural causes, thankfully, but his his death is still marked today by Republicans, and this is a guy who died while literally on a Nazi U-boat. And again, we've got some more quotes here. Jerry Arafat is just a very interesting one, combining Jerry Adams and Yasser Arafat, of course, two Republican leaders over the last, you could say from the period of late 20th century.
At this point, Jamie displayed a clip of him questioning Mary Lou MacDonald regarding the little-known historical and ideological commonalities between Ireland and Israel. In true Sinn Féin fashion, however, she ignored what she didn't like.
So yeah, this is me taking the fight to the leader of modern day Sinn Féin, Mary Lou MacDonald. This was last November ahead of the election, and she was on campus. Essentially, of course, I only got about 45 seconds with her. I tried to make those points that I mentioned about early Republican figures being sympathetic to Zionism. Now, I was probably too polite because her response was frankly nonsense. She was bringing up these figures of Irish nationalism who were opposed to, as they call it, the occupation from an early stage, and I'm annoyed I didn't get to reply to that. But that video is online, and I think you'd be able to find it on TikTok, posted by that woman from the Irish Examiner. But yeah, it's just a funny picture to reflect back on.
Now Jamie goes on to talk about October 7th and Ireland's peculiar response of indifference to the slaughter of 1,200 Jews, including one Irish citizen, and the taking of 300 hostages, including another Irish citizen.
Now, we're moving into the time post-October 7th. This is a photo I took myself at the site of the Nova Festival when I was there earlier in May. We all, of course, know what happened on October 7th. We don't need to dredge that back up again. But it's always been one of the most tragic things to me that two of our own citizens were so directly impacted by the terrorists of Hamas on October 7th. And that went out the window after 1 week. You had initial condemnations, but at no stage since then have they been brought up as part of the Irish discussion towards the conflict. And I think it's very demonstrative as well that Emily Hand's father, Thomas, who you can see on the right here, has vowed, I think a few months ago, saying that he would never return to Ireland because in his eyes, Palestinian statehood recognition by Simon Harris last year was a reward for the exact behaviour of kidnapping his daughter and slaughtering 1,200 innocent Israelis. So this is from the October 7th ceremony last year. But this is a photo that I took from the event, and I just thought it was very interesting that there was no official government representative sent to attend that event, whereas across Europe, other heads of state, not only last year but this year as well, were attending similar ceremonies. And I think it's very demonstrative again that there was no Irish minister or head of state present. So as I say, I have a bit of a gripe with Fine Gael because maybe in another life they would have been a party that I would correspond to. But they have unfortunately not been any sort of barrier against the wave of anti-Israel sentiment in Ireland. Myself and Daniel Epstein O'Dowd, who some of you will know, wrote an article about this It's on my Substack, which we'll come to at the end.
Here he touches on the collapse of diplomatic relations between Ireland and Israel, typified by the closing of the Israeli embassy in the wake of Simon Harris's crusade to set up a Palestinian embassy, in effect rewarding Hamas for October 7th.
So the question of embassies, now this was a very illustrative thing that happened last year. After countless diplomatic assaults, Gideon Sa'ar, the Israeli foreign minister, decided to withdraw the embassy in Dublin last December. However, only 4 months earlier, September 2024, we had opened up an embassy in Tehran, no less. And I just thought that was such highlights, unfortunately, our foreign policy over the last couple of years. We open an embassy in Tehran, the Israeli embassy in Dublin closes. And if you'll go to the next slide. A photo from Google Maps of our embassy in Tehran as it is today. This is not from last year, admittedly. This is Simon Coveney a couple of years ago meeting. But again, it's just a really awful photo. I mean, you've the Ayatollah on the wall there behind. And as I say, you walk onto the street in Tehran today, you will see the Irish harp of our new embassy. And again, just the links with Iran. This is Michael McNamara, a seemingly centre-right politician in Ireland, who was praised by an Iranian government spokesperson for his comments in the European Parliament. It just shows who we're aligning with internationally. This was a letter last July after the death of President Raisi in a helicopter crash. We had the election of the current president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, and this man, our current president for the next 2 weeks anyway, wrote what can only be described as a love letter, talking of the great relations between Ireland and Iran and the future opportunities for cooperation. And this was in January of this year, actually, the Iranian Charge d'Affaires in Dublin. Just being shown around Leinster House by Count Corla Verona Murphy. Just like any normal, pleasant country, really. Yeah, and it's no accident as well that many politicians have no interest in highlighting the toxic role that Iran plays in the Middle East. So, May 2024, Simon Harris, one of the first things he does when he gets into the office is he recognises the state of Palestine alongside Spain and Norway. Of course, he recognised the state with no defined borders, no defined capital, no defined government. But that didn't stop him, and shamefully so, as we saw the Palestinian flag flying above Leinster House at the time. And then this is the ambassador who now resides in Dublin. She has never found it within herself to condemn October 7th, or say that Hamas should disarm, or say that the hostages should be immediately released. She is no moderate figure for the Palestinian Authority. And yet, Simon Harris thinks it's great that he can swan around with her. Because unfortunately, he has, I think more than anyone within Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, latched onto this cause. Part of the quote is actually cut out at the top, but I remember after the embassy was withdrawn in December last year, he wanted to say that Ireland is not anti-Israel, but we are pro-peace, pro-international law and pro-human rights. But he'd no interest in highlighting any of those three things with any of these guys. So this is Li Qiang, Prime Minister of China, famous for their wonderful human rights, I'm sure we can all agree. This is Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani, the Prime Minister of Qatar. It seemingly didn't interest Harris that thousands of migrant workers are in Qatar in horrendous conditions and have had their passports taken off them. This is President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt on the top right there, a guy, a military general who seized power in a coup and who, in his last election, conspicuously won 90% of the vote. So great democracy, as we can see there in Egypt, and Simon Harris really upholding those values when it comes to other countries. This was actually the triggering point that led to the embassy to withdraw. Ireland joining the ICJ genocide case led by South Africa last December. That case has gone nowhere, with good reason, of course. And this was actually only yesterday, the South African minister with Simon Harris. Again, we're lining up with all of the wrong people. And as I say, if we want to talk about human rights, one of the niche things about South Africa that is a real stain on the country at the moment is the levels of sexual violence. The rate of rapes within the country over the last 2 years has been horrific. But of course, he's no interest in raising that. The only country he wants to pillory internationally is Israel. Again, I would like to think, and this has been noticed, no doubt, by people on Capitol Hill who have written letters to Ireland over our relationship with the Palestinian cause over the last few months. This is Simon Harris' new best friend on the international stage. This is President Mahmoud Abbas, a guy who's in his 20th year of a 4-year term. He does have a very sinister background, unfortunately, as well, though. Only 2 years ago, he was saying at a Fatah party conference in Ramallah that Hitler did not kill Jews for being Jews, he killed them for their role in society. And this is Simon Harris with him at the General Assembly in New York last year. And this is who Mahmoud Abbas was swanning around with only a month earlier. He went to Moscow, he visited Putin, he told him that he was one of the great friends of the Palestinian people, and he was also in Beijing expressing support for Xi Jinping, because as we know, it's part of a broader framework. China is happy to assist in this sort of axis of evil, as we were talking about, through Iran, or for example, it's Chinese technology that's being used by the Houthis down in Yemen. So again, just a wonderful alliance by our wise foreign minister.
The next brace of clips are a commentary on a montage of photos dealing with the more recent cultural ties forged between Ireland and the Arabs living in the disputed territories of Gaza and Judea and Samaria. The montage included images of Irish people waving flags of prescribed terrorist organisations on the streets of Dublin.
So yeah, we're moving into some of the cultural ties here that I fear are going to be a bit harder to break over the next few years, even if the political scene dies down. This is a BDS comparison. BDS is a very anti-Semitic organisation led by one Omar Barghouti, a guy who himself studied in Israel, but he wants to see Israel delegitimised on the international stage. And then on your right here, these are members of the Palestinian international football team who played a match against Bose last year. And of course, they get a warm welcome in the Oris, you know. Compared to the Israeli women's basketball team, who our own national team, I'm ashamed to say, refused to shake their hands and refused to actually face them during the anthem. And then, of course, on the bottom right, I mean, my dad and I, we like a lot of music from Christy Moore, but there he is on Virgin Media bleating on about the devastation of Palestinians and saying that the region was wrecked when the Zionists arrived. And we all know what that means, of course. And this is what I mean in terms of these sorts of cultural ties are very, very damaging to any potential re-emergence of an Irish-Israel relationship. That's O'Connell Street Bridge, that's the PFLP flag, Hamas flag and Hezbollah all being waved openly. All three of those are prescribed terrorist organisations by the EU, but on the streets of Dublin, these can be waved openly, unfortunately. And when there's no consequences for actions like this, you get actions like this. So these are all in the last year. Israeli business in spat at in March. I'm sure we've all seen the videos of these. Our poor friend Liran here was...
I'm the guy on the ballot.
So as I said, when we see those flags of such abhorrent organisations being waved openly, of course the consequences are going to be this.
And lest we forget the embarrassing so-called Pigs Bill or Occupied Territories Bill.
Now, the Occupied Territories Bill that has been rebranded as the Prohibition on the Importation of Goods Bill, also known as the Pigs Bill, is still technically in progress. Now, I believe that it ultimately won't be passed because of, thankfully, pressure from our friends in America. But this is a photo from the committee hearing in July. The video of that is still on the Oireachtas website, and I advise anyone to look at it because it's one of the most illustrating hour and a half of the ignorance of Irish politicians on the region. One of the most baffling moments in it was, of course, when Alan Shatter rightly tried to point out that prior to 1967, the area known as the West Bank was occupied by Jordan, and there was no interest in a Palestinian state at that time, at which Fine Gael TD Barry Ward called it whataboutery. So apparently historical commentary is just whataboutery and it's to be ignored, and it was a really sad insight into how little Irish politicians are willing to kind of use their heads and critically think about the matter. Again, so this is our Taoiseach Micheál Martin in an UNRWA school in Ramallah, I believe, boasting about Irish money to UNRWA, which funds the schools. This is the type of stuff that is in the Palestinian Authority curriculum funded by UNRWA. You can read these yourselves. It's essentially using maths and science for kids of primary school age, teaching them about martyrdom, about overcoming the settlers or the Zionists, destroying Israel, in other words, glorifying violence, whether it be in the form of a suicide bomber like Dalal al-Mughrabi or someone throwing stones. And of course, what's remarkable is you'll actually see people in like People Before Profit trying to minimise, what's throwing stones? Stones can kill, of course, and they have.
Yeah.
And then yes, this was seen in our own school books report last November of, again, primary school age, talking about Jesus being born in Palestine. That no word existed at that time. Mm-hmm. It also minimised Auschwitz. It called it a prisoner of war camp, which is just outrageous. And there was a hint at the old stereotype of Jesus being killed by the Jews as well. And it wasn't actually even recognised by anyone in the government until July, when it was raised by Alan Shatter.
In this next clip, Jamie comments on the contribution that Irish artists of various disciplines, together with the journalists of erstwhile respectable media corporations, have helped to make anti-Israel commentary and sentiment and behaviour more mainstream. The clip opens with a damning appraisal of the Irish band Kneecap.
So these guys, I said I'd come back to them, the absolute scum that are infecting the ears of the youth today. And not just the youth, actually. People who work in the Irish Times who are in their 50s think these guys are cool.
Yeah.
So this is them glorifying, of course, openly Hezbollah and Hamas. They, of course, tried to walk this back and say that they hadn't, but they were very proud of their statements. So I don't know what they're trying to claim there. Meanwhile, while they glorify Hezbollah, Hezbollah murders our own soldiers. So this is Private Sean Rooney, killed by Hezbollah in Lebanon in late 2022. But this is who these guys want to associate with, and it's unfortunately these guys are headlining EP, and no Irish politician will even call them out. Again, some more ridiculous things here. This is Sinead Gilney from the Social Democrats saying that she'll keep getting her nails done in the Palestinian colours, because that is so valuable. And this is Connolly Books, openly selling merch of Yahya Sinwar, and Sally Rooney on the right here, who is a despicable but successful author and novelist, saying that she will openly support Palestine Action, the UK prescribed terrorist group. She has also refused to have her books translated into Hebrew in the past. And again, it's not, as I say, it's more and more mainstream. The Irish Times, once seen as the sensible middle-class paper of Ireland, is now just spouting this absolute nonsense. So this is essentially a woman trying to say that she should be ashamed of her Star of David. She actually credited Michael D. Higgins in that article, which is an extraordinary thing. And of course, she doesn't represent Irish Jews as well. That's the worst part. It's tokenization. And this is the extraordinary thing that a lot of people aren't aware of because of the lack of a common second name. They're married. So Conor Pope, the consumer affairs correspondent of the Irish Times, and Sonia Harris are a couple, and they have together, along with other writers such as Fintan O'Toole, Una Mullally, these types of people, really push the needle beyond sort of anti-Israel sentiment into explicit negativity towards Judaism. And this is Conor Pope. Again, I used to see this guy on the paper on Saturday lying on my table at home very often. But here he is, as Rachel Moselle saying, beware these micro-consumer products because they could be linked to the Jewish state. And what a tragedy that would be. Of course, he's not calling out any consumer goods from any other nation in the world. It's only Israel that he likes to target. Go on. Now, this was last month. I, alongside a few other members of the Jewish community, Morris Cohen, Chief Rabbi, this is Leo actually, who we saw earlier from the Holocaust commemoration event in January. So it was, as he called it, a meeting with the Jewish community. We unfortunately didn't get to discuss anything related to the war. What was crucial from my perspective was that I made him aware of the treatment that myself, Anthony, and a few other guys from DCU received back in March by the university. Now look, he seemed empathetic on the day, but he's very good at feigning sincerity, as we know, and there's been no follow-up meeting since then.
In the following clip, Jamie gives an appraisal of Catherine Connolly. The clip includes some disturbing and noteworthy elements on her CV, particularly regarding the State of Israel.
Categorically one of the most diabolical candidates for any election I've seen in my life. That includes outside of Ireland as well. Wow. Very anti-Western politician. So, for example, her casual visit to Assadist Syria back in 2018. I mean, who doesn't go on a trip to Aleppo? Alongside Mick Wallace and Claire Daly. But this is also a woman who totally failed to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. She's totally apathetic towards Iran. One of the most outrageous things I think she said in recent days is that if Hamas is to disarm, Israel must also disarm, which is just an extraordinary thing to say. If you look back over the years, one of the worst things she's ever said is floating this notion of a sort of Jewish supremacy in relation to Israel being a Jewish state. She's no interest, of course, in Albania being a state for the Albanians and all of these other examples. But Jews living and with self-determination within Israel is something that should be referred to as Jewish control and Jewish supremacy by her. And again, I hate to say it, Anthony and I talk about this a lot. We kind of despair on our own generation a lot in terms of how much they don't seem to care about these types of things that are said by her. They'll like her because she speaks Irish.
At this point of his presentation, Jamie displayed a photo of the Palestinian flag and asked what entity it represented. His answer is nothing short of illuminating. Have a listen.
Yeah. Quick quiz for you. Can anyone tell me the entity that this flag represents? This is 1958, the Hashemite Arab Federation of Iraq and Jordan. It only lasted 6 months, but it should be a hell of a lot more famous than it is. So 1958, King Faisal of Iraq, I believe he was only 23 at the time, and this is King Hussein of Jordan, the man who was king until 1999. His son, King Abdullah II, is now the King of Jordan. Long story short, essentially, when the Brits assumed control of this area under the League of Nations, they carved out these new nation states, of course not taking any interest in the actual ethnicities and peoples living there at the time or the tribal nature. But the new states of Iraq and Jordan were founded. And classic colonial style, they simply implanted this Hashemite family who were from down in kind of Hijaz, Mecca area, just made them the new rulers of this area. Actually, an insight kind of 30, 40 years beforehand is, of course, Lawrence of Arabia. Faisal, this man's father, is played by Alec Guinness in that film, and he went on to be king of Iraq, Alec Guinness's character. But in 1958, these two fellas, they're kings of their respective nations, Iraq and Jordan. Say Anthony and I were cousins. I'm king of Jordan, he's king of Iraq. We border each other. Why don't we just merge and become our own federation? And at that stage, they took on this flag. So that's March 1958, the classic red, black, white, and green that we see all over Dublin today. And interestingly enough, it only lasted 6 months because Faisal here at the bottom was overthrown and killed. And so Iraq continued as its own nation state, changed form. It lasted as a republic for about 10 years before the Ba'athists took over, and then Saddam Hussein came 10 years after that. King Hussein, he lasted until 1999, as I said. But what, of course, is very interesting about this map is that you can actually see modern-day Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, Yehuda Veshomron in Hebrew, occupied by Jordan at that time. So it was part of this entity that, as I said, only lasted 6 months in 1958. But, as I say, it died a very quick death. And only 6 years later, a Egyptian by the name of Yasser Arafat decides he wants to found a new organization. Arafat strictly it wasn't the original founder. But in 1964, the PLO come along and they just simply adopt and steal this flag from the failed entity 6 years before. There is no distinct Palestinian identity that is linked at all to this flag. And if you look at a map of the 10, 15 countries around the Levant and the Gulf area, you'll see that every other flag uses a combination of those colours in some form. I think actually at a march in Dublin, I saw it last year. I remember people were openly waving the flag of Sudan, delighted with themselves. It's the first time I've seen accidental solidarity for what's going on in Dermot. As Dermot correctly says, the Jordanian flag is of course the exact same. It's just got a small white star in the little red triangle there. So yeah, again, that's another thing. You get into an argument with people, you get into a debate, they start talking about distinct Palestinian identity, generations going back. No, their flag was only taken for the first time in 1964 and it was stolen from a failed entity of their fellow Arabs 6 years earlier.
In the following clip, Jamie gives an overview of the so-called two-state solution and explains why it has never worked. If you're not familiar with this topic, it may come as a surprise to know that blame for the forever failed two-state solution falls squarely on the shoulders of the Arabs in Judea, Samaria and Gaza.
Judea and Samaria was held by Jordan following on from the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And this is a very important thing. 1967 is seen as a bit of a turning point in the conflict and in Israel's history as a nation. It kind of launched the idea of Israel being a strong, powerful country that, of course, has ultimately climaxed in today. I think it's fair to say that Israel has never been in a better place than it is in 2025, despite it all. But if anyone ever tries to say to you also that there could have been peace-founded, a two-state solution, a nonsense two-state solution, if Israel would just give up the territories that they took in 1967. So simply we're talking about here and then the Gaza Strip there, which was controlled by Egypt at the time. What's very interesting, of course, is at that stage in June 1967, when Jordan, Egypt, Syria invaded, that wasn't enough for them at that stage. Having that land, there was no interest in setting up any Arab self-governance or or independence, they wanted all of the land. And if you listen to any Palestinians, whether it be within Fatah or Hamas or any other so-called moderates like Marwan Barghouti, they all refer to the whole breadth of the land. And this is because of the endless narrative that has been allowed to thrive amongst Palestinians, that it is their right to have all of the land of the original British mandate, even areas that were never under Arab control since 1948. I remember watching a speech a few weeks ago speaking about this lie that is being sold to the Palestinians that they can have all of the land. For example, I was in East Jerusalem in May and I was talking with a Palestinian bookshop owner, and I asked him, how can you defend Yasser Arafat rejecting the deal in 2000 that would have given the Palestinians an independent state on 96% of this land and a capital in East Jerusalem, which they only care about, by the way, because the Al-Aqsa Mosque is there, which was built on top of the former Jewish Temple Mount. And I asked him, how can you defend rejecting a deal on 96% of the land? As Bill Clinton even says, you can't reject a deal that good and then 25 years later come along and say that, oh yeah, sorry, we made a mistake, now we want the same deal. And this bookshop owner in East Jerusalem, who was appearing like a moderate, I'm talking to him openly, and he says, well, you got to understand, in the Palestinians' mind, that is only 96% of the 22%. And of course, in his mind, that other 78% is also entitled to them. And as I said, I was watching a speech a few weeks ago given by an Israeli politician, and he's saying, well, the Arabs had East Jerusalem and they weren't happy with it, so they wanted West Jerusalem. And if they wanted West Jerusalem, what makes you think that they don't want West Haifa or West Tel Aviv or West Akko or even West Eilat down here? But as I say, if anyone ever tries to tell you that Israel is responsible for a Palestinian state not being set up, you have to remind them that those areas were occupied by their fellow Arabs at the time and they had no interest. And most interestingly, I think it was August of 1967, 2 months after that, with the Arab League summit, famous 3 no's of the Khartoum resolution: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel.
In this final part of his presentation, Jamie asked the valid question, where to now? He compared Israel's culture of life with Hamas's culture of death, and asks some poignant questions about Europe's lack of leadership and whether our societies in the West can do what Israel has done in fighting a real war on multiple fronts and a propaganda war in the West. Have a listen.
So, where to now? A couple of photos here. I think this photo could well go down in history, almost reminiscent of George W. Bush being told about 9/11 in 2001. Marco Rubio there, US Secretary of State, informing President Trump that a deal had been struck last night. Photos in the top left and bottom right are photos from Tel Aviv over the last 24 hours. It's beautiful to see the joy in people, and it's fantastic that the hostages are hopefully coming home over the next 72 hours. But there are also a lot of things going forward that are going to be challenging, and a lot of people are going to have to take them on. While I'm very happy about the deal and an end to the war, of course, and the sacrifices that have been made by so many heroic IDF soldiers, many of whom are younger than me, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be challenged with. And I think there are so many photos you could highlight, but this photo in the top right here, that's Emily DeMaria, I believe, being released in a hostage exchange deal in Gaza in January. And I just think when you look at that, it highlights so well the huge cultural problem that is going to persist, whether there's active fighting or not, amongst Gazan or Palestinian and particularly Gazan culture. They have been so radicalized under Hamas rule for a series of decades that that's how you have a culture where children celebrate seeing the body of people like Shani Luke. So I think it's going to be a big challenge, culturally speaking, over the next few years to try and de-radicalize the Palestinian population. And I'm not sure exactly where that's going to come from. It can't be forced externally by Western powers. That doesn't work, as we saw in things like the invasion of Iraq, for example. But you need a sufficient amount of Palestinian moderates, and I'm not sure they're really there at the moment. But I also wanted to show those pictures in the comparison, for example, because it demonstrates the fundamental difference between the two societies. On the bottom right, you have people cheering because a bunch of innocent young men, well, at this stage all of them are young men, are being brought home having been kidnapped as hostages. The scenes we see in Gaza of them celebrating over the last years, they're celebrating because they're getting prisoners, many of whom with blood on their hands, returned to them. And so you look at the difference of what each society holds up. One holds up life, one holds up death. I'd advise anyone to read Douglas Murray more than anyone in terms of highlighting the difference between the societies. And these two men on the bottom here, I think this is actually going to tie into the war, or the effects of this war leading into the coming years, as part of a Western struggle. Because when you've cowardly leaders, the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century, like Keir Starmer, who recognises the Palestinian state and rewards Khalil al-Hayya, leader of Hamas at the moment, they say openly, people like him, people like Ghazi Hamad, who was also at the negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, they say explicitly that Western states recognising a Palestinian state is a distinct outcome of their murderous assaults on October 7th. And in Israel, I've been there since the war, and like we've Israelis in the room. I've never seen a population in my lifetime stand up to an existential challenge like that, of wars being waged against them by 7 fronts by the Iranians, and you also have this enormous propaganda war being waged by people like the BBC, by the UN, by Western states, etc. But they've shown they have the guts to stand up to all of that. The question that I worry about for Europe in particular is, do our societies have that mettle? Because with guys like him doing things like that, you really don't. And I know only 2 days ago, on the anniversary of October 7th, no less, a lot of universities around the UK had students coming out explicitly praising the actions of 2 years ago, coming out saying things like "glory to the martyrs," and the presidents of all of these various universities were actually pleading with the students, don't come out tomorrow, don't protest on October 7th, that's awful. So what sort of situation have we gotten to where the inmates are actually running the prison here? Where you have the Prime Minister of the nation who's asking a bunch of 20-year-olds in university to not go out and promote terror on the anniversary of the worst day for Jews since the Holocaust. I mean, I would have liked to thought that a leader with a bit of balls, frankly, would have sent out riot police to put those people off 2 days ago. And so a person that I'd advise anyone to read who writes about this very well in recent times is Jake Wallace-Simons. He wrote a book called Israelophobia 2 years ago. He writes a lot for the Telegraph, the Jewish Chronicle, etc. And he's written very well about the cultural challenge that Western states are going to have to face up to. You've Israel, a country that defends its citizens to such an incredible degree, whereas you've Britain that has absolute open borders, communities around the country that are totally radicalised, have no connection to Britain, no integration. Britain didn't prescribe Hizb ut-Tahrir as a terrorist organisation until I think 18 months ago. The Muslim Brotherhood still aren't prescribed. And unfortunately, these guys, like Khalil al-Hayya, Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, a group set up by Hassan al-Banna that has motivated essentially every bit of jihadism over the last 50 years. They are seeing these actions by people like Starmer, by people like Macron, by Mark Carney in Canada. Thankfully, some leaders in Europe have stood strong. But as I say, it's going to be the real challenge of society standing up for their own values and beliefs against the people who would like to destroy our way of life, like this man and his backers in Tehran. So that is essentially the end of things, but just going forward, if anyone wants to check out what me or some of the other people in this room are doing, a couple of links, my LinkedIn, my Substack, my Times of Israel blog are all my name, my Instagram's private actually, but I'm sure I'll recognise you. And then I've done a couple of interviews on YouTube with CBN News and GB News, and I'd also advise everyone to check out John's Ireland Israel podcast, easily found on Google if you look it up, and I did an episode with him over the summer. So that marks the end of the formal slides, and thank you all for coming.